Imagine walking into a conversation where you already know how it's going to end. Not because you're louder, more aggressive, or more stubborn, but because you understand how the human mind works. Most people think arguments are about facts, logic, or who has the better points. But in reality, arguments are rarely won on logic alone. They are won in the invisible space of emotions, perception, and psychology. Think about it. How many times have you seen someone completely ignore solid facts just because they felt attacked? Or double down on a weak opinion just to protect their ego? That's because arguments are not intellectual battles. They are emotional negotiations. And the person who understands this has a massive advantage. Winning an argument psychologically doesn't mean manipulating people or being dishonest. It means knowing how to guide the conversation in a way that keeps the other person open, receptive, and willing to shift their perspective. It's about influence, not force. Because the moment someone feels forced, they resist. But when they feel understood, they start to listen. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 powerful psychological ways to win almost any argument, calmly, intelligently, and effectively. These are strategies used by skilled negotiators, leaders, and people who seem to always get their point across without creating conflict. If you can master these, you won't just win arguments, you'll control the direction of conversations. Let's get into it. Way 1. Control emotions before controlling the argument. The first and most important rule is this: if you lose emotional control, you lose the argument, no matter how right you are. When emotions rise, logic shuts down. This applies not just to you, but even more to the person you're arguing with. Psychologically, when someone feels attacked, their brain goes into defense mode. Instead of listening, they start preparing counterattacks. This is why arguments often spiral into shouting matches that go nowhere. So the real strategy is not to overpower emotions, but to stabilize them. Speak calmly, keep your tone neutral, and most importantly, avoid making the other person feel stupid or cornered. The calmer you are, the more pressure builds on the other person to match your energy. There's also a subtle psychological trick here. When you remain composed while the other person gets emotional, observers, and even the person themselves, begin to perceive you as more credible. Calmness signals confidence and control, while emotional reactions signal insecurity or weakness. In simple terms, the person who controls emotions controls the direction of the argument. Way 2. Make them feel heard before making your point. One of the biggest mistakes people make in arguments is trying to prove their point before the other person feels understood. Humans have a deep psychological need to feel heard and validated. Until that need is met, they will resist anything you say, even if it makes perfect sense. So instead of interrupting or immediately disagreeing, do something unexpected. Listen actively. Let them finish. Then repeat their point in your own words. This does 2 things. First, it shows respect. Second, it lowers their defensiveness. For example, instead of saying, "That's wrong," you can say, "I understand why you see it that way because..." This doesn't mean you agree, it means you acknowledge their perspective. Once someone feels heard, their brain relaxes. They become more open to new information. That's when you introduce your argument. This is powerful because now it feels like a conversation, not a battle. And psychologically, people are far more likely to change their mind when they don't feel pressured to do so. Guide. Don't confront. If you directly tell someone they are wrong, their instinct is to defend themselves. But if you guide them to question their own position, they begin to convince themselves, and that's far more effective. This is where strategic questioning comes in. Instead of making statements, ask questions that gently expose gaps in their logic. For example, instead of saying, "That doesn't make sense," you can ask, "How do you think that would work in this situation?" Or, "What would happen if the opposite were true?" These kinds of questions shift the mental effort onto them. Now they are thinking, analyzing, and sometimes even realizing inconsistencies on their own. Psychologically, self-realization is much more powerful than being corrected. When people arrive at a conclusion themselves, they are far more likely to accept it and stick with it. This method also keeps the conversation non-confrontational. You're not attacking, you're exploring. And that keeps resistance low while gradually steering the argument in your favor.